My name is Julia and I'm a first-year PhD student here at CSM. My PhD is practice-based and it's fine art practice. I'm going to be talking about my involvement with the collection at the CSM Museum. First of all, I'm sorry that I'm not able to be here with you in person, but hopefully through this video I can talk to you about my research. I'm going to be talking first about what interests me in the collection at CSM, so about medieval prints and a bit of the historical context. Then I'm going to talk about how this relates to my research, so where medieval prints are located within my PhD. And then I'm going to show you some images that I've used from the collection and what it is that interests me about these images and what I'm looking for in my analysis. And finally, I'll show you some of my work so you can see how medieval prints inform my practice. Within the CSM Museum collection, I've been looking at medieval European prints. This is what I'm interested in. The very first prints done in Europe were woodcuts, and I'm gonna look at my notes on the history of woodcuts in Europe. In the book A History of Wood Engraving by Douglas Percy Bliss, I'm quoting, "The most ancient European example is on cloth, probably one of 3 pieces representing a crucifixion, and this is from 1350. So it's in the 14th century when we get the first prints. And they were very much, they served a role in Christian faith. The motivation force between early publishers was the propagation of faith. But at the same time, there is the popular use of playing cards. So these are the 2 main uses of very early prints. I'm quoting again from A History of Wood Engraving. 2 social factors made for the development of prints: pilgrimages and card playing. Single sheets were sold to the pilgrims, simple representations in outline, colored rudely and brightly of the great incidents of the life of Christ, and figures of Sebastian, Christopher, Dorothea, and others of the favorite saints. These had great popularity in Germany." Now, these very early prints that were on single sheets, they survived because they were pasted in book covers, cabinet doors, traveling chests, trunks, or wardrobes. And most of them had been designed to serve the purpose of warding off disease and death, fire, or robbery by showing images of popular patron saints. This last quote is from The Art of the Print by Fritz Eschenberg. And I want to show you an example of this, where early prints would have been in single sheets and they were kept inside boxes, like this one, for example. It's a representation of the Nativity of Christ, and it's from 1490, so that's late 15th century. You can see how it's been put in the inside of the lid of the box, so it's quite protected. And I have a detail here. Now, after the single sheets, the earliest books that were published were called cunabula, where the whole page of the book would have been 1 block of wood. And these are from the first half of the 15th century. Then with the printing revolution and the printing press and from Johann Gutenberg, we get movable type. And so the words, the whole page, the whole written page wouldn't have been carved from the same single block, but now we get the separate letters, each letter carved in wood, and they could be moved around to produce the different words and phrases and different texts, like in letterpress. There are two very important publishing, printing centers in Europe, and that is Italy and Germany. An important publishing center in Italy would be Venice, where in 1494 they published Fascicolo di Medicina, an illustrated book on medicine with anatomical illustrations. And by the end of the 15th century, the workshop of Titian was very famous, and they did some of the illustrations for Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the fabric of the human body, a landmark on anatomical illustration. Now, I'm particularly interested in religious and anatomical meanings, so my research focuses on early prints up until 1543, when the Humani Corporis fabric was printed. The reason why I look at medieval prints is because I'm interested in the representation of the wound, and this is the kind of images that I work with. The Martyrdom of St Erasmus. These are all from the 15th century, and they are these are Martyrdom of Saints, Stigmata. This is St Francis. St Francis again. I'm looking at the way the body is represented and the way the opening of the body is represented. So in skeletons, a lot of the time you get, to represent death, skeletons with big wounds, empty or rotting flesh. And of course the wounds of Christ. There are a lot of crucifixions, which are all slightly different in style. But they follow a certain iconography. The angels with cups collecting the blood, for example. So they all have the same kind of feeling to them, and I try to adopt this kind of iconography and line work in my practice. My PhD is practice-based, and I use printmaking and performance to look at the representation of the wound. So medieval prints, and especially anatomical prints and religious prints that depict the wound of Christ, are especially relevant to my work. My research question is, how are gender, anatomy and religion interconnected in the representation of the opening of the body? And my practice-based PhD aims to examine the representation of the access to the interior of the body beyond the limit of the skin, looking at body opening as a whole, encompassing both artificially created wounds and natural orifices. So I'm drawing comparisons between any aperture that goes beyond or despite the skin and accesses the inside of the body. The theoretical and practical aim is to address the relationship between gender, religion and anatomy in the representation of the opening of the body within Western visual culture, and to ask through practice, How can the opening of the body be represented? I look at the relationship between gender, encompassing traditional gender, biological sex, and sexuality, early anatomical illustrations in the context of the origins of dissection in Europe, medieval religious iconography, focusing on biblical illustrations, and the use of the wound and the orifice in body art. I will explore the connections between the dissector's cut, the religiously charged wound, and the body orifice in my creative practice, informed by theoretical research and my identity as a female Spanish artist. I will use printmaking and performance in relation to the aperture of the body and associated historical contexts of early dissection and body art. So in my practice, printmaking is not only the medium I use, but also a historical context that I'm interested in, because printmaking is historically related to dissection practices, because they were directly linked to the first anatomical illustrations. The goal of my research is to bring an original artistic perspective to the representation of the aperture by combining printmaking and performance and positioning the vagina as a central analogy. So I'm interested in the representation of the wound, and I'm considering anatomical meaning from dissection practices and religious meaning, mainly from Christianity and the representation of the wounds of Christ. But I'm also considering how vaginal symbolism could add to the understanding of how the wound, where the wound is located within Western culture and its symbolism. The aims of my research are to develop new insights into the connections between gender, religion, and anatomy in early anatomical representation, to develop through practice an original feminist artistic perspective that addresses Western traditions of representing the opening of the body, and to combine printmaking and performance to contribute new ways to represent the aperture within contemporary visual art. My objectives are to develop an original interpretation of the connections between gender, religion, and anatomy in early European prints, informed by an analysis of historical images, the study of the relevant literature, and my artistic practice. To appropriate medieval iconography to contest traditional meanings by drawing new connections between gender, religion, and anatomy, and using vaginal symbolism. To analyze the use of the wound and the orifice in body art, and to combine printmaking and performance to address the representation of the opening of the body, informed by body art, medieval imagery, and vaginal symbolism. The historical context of my PhD is very much related to medieval prints. I am looking at the gendered relationship between subject and object in early modern European dissection culture, which has already been addressed by Gilman, Saudet, and Park, and has also been addressed in the context of 18th to 20th century medical images by Jordanova, and in modern American gynecology by Capsalis. I focus on medieval prints from the 13th century until 1543's Vesalius's Fabrica, in the context of the origins of dissection. Because I want to ask, are gender, religion, and anatomy the three main discourses shaping the meaning of the opening of the body in medieval culture? To what extent are medieval understandings reflected on contemporary notions? In terms of the contemporary context, I'm going to look at body art, from the works of the Viennese actionists from the 1960s until now, due to the persistent use of the wound and the sexual body orifice in body art. especially self-cutting, in the work of artists like Gina Payne or Franco B, for example. I will focus on contemporary live art, and especially Ron Athey, whose work explicitly engages with gender, religion and medicine. The theoretical context is mainly a feminist and social constructivist approach. I'm going to draw on visual and cultural studies, on social sciences, to study the representation of the aperture in the West. And I aim to develop an original critical discourse informed by art and performance theory as well. My perspective on the body will also be informed by a phenomenological approach, as explored by authors such as Jung and Farquhar and Locke, which are drawing on the ideas of Merleau-Ponty. I will also draw on anthropology, psychology and psychoanalysis to study key concepts such as paternity, maternity, creation, sacrifice, skin, blood, the self-inflicted wound and menstruation. My methodology will encompass theoretical research and creative practice, continuously informing each other. Printmaking is crucial due to a creative association between printmaking processes and surgery. Wounding and cutting the plate become parallel to wounding and cutting the body and anatomical representations, for instance. The use of sharp tools in printmaking and particular clothing, like the white gloves, like in surgery. And also the fact that surgery and printmaking share highly staged and contrived actions like rituals. The body in performance is also part of my method, of my practice, because according to Jones, it has enormous potential to contest the meanings inscribed in the normative body. So I'm especially interested in how the body in performance can contest and challenge the religious and anatomical meanings. Having outlined my PhD proposal, because now I'm going through the stage of registration, I want to show you some of the images that I used from the CSM collection. The first two images that we can see here are the first one from the Martyrdom of St Erasmus, and the second one is the Stigmata of St Francis. So, and these are from the 16th century. So as we can see, the wound is very much present in religious prints. Not only in the wounds of Christ, but also in the martyrdom of the saints, the way they were killed, and also in the stigmata. In the second image, it appears that it represents a bloodletting scene. It was quite common at the time. It was a cure for disease. They thought that if the body was cut in a particular place and in a particular way, the letting of blood would cure the person, basically. This is a detail of the image. And different parts of the body were associated to different zodiac signs, so it also depended on the time of the year and the calendar. They would take that into account to see what part of the body needed to be cut to let blood out. This third image is of the birth of Eve. It's also from the 16th century, and as we can see, in the background we can see Adam and Eve with the snake and Eve taking the apple, and on the right side we can see how that action leads to them being expelled from paradise. But at the forefront we can see how God is taking Eve from Adam's side, and this side of Adam is very much like a wound where Eve is coming out from. It's not an uncommon representation. In this next image we can see it again, and in a lot of biblical illustrations this is the way it's represented. So God is extracting Eve, and in a way Adam is giving birth to Eve. So particularly this scene is very interesting to me, because it was when I started to think about the opening of the body in relation to the vagina. Because here the side opening or wound from which Eve is coming out is very much drawing on vaginal symbolism, because it's birthing, it's giving birth, and the first woman, Eve, is not really the source of creation or of birthing, but instead birthing is being substituted by the wound. Now I would like to show you some of my work. This is a print that has been done with screen printing and etching plates. Most of the drawing is screen printed, and there is 3 etching plates that have been cut to size to fit on the inside of Adam and the inside of Eve to represent the interior of their bodies. So the plate is embossed and it goes slightly inwards into the paper. And the 3rd plate is the little round plate at the bottom that represents their offspring. This print is 80 centimeters by 120 centimeters, so it's quite large. It's very detailed, and it draws heavily on medieval iconography. The title is Divine Fabrica, and it's taken from Vesalius's Fabrica, and it's exploring how Vesalius's work is located within religious ideology of the time. At the background we can see Eve being born out of Adam, and just below there is a caption in the scroll, the flowing scroll, that reads, "God created man in his own image and caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and from his side he created Eve." This quote is taken from the Bible, but it's not a literal quotation. It's been slightly modified, and it basically highlights how Eve is essentially thought of as secondary, because she is derived from Adam. As you can see on the opening on the side of Adam, it's been represented, I've represented it in terms of vaginal symbolism, with the 2 lips that one of them God is pulling to part to take Eve out. And at the same time it's also related to the dissector's cut, because Adam is asleep on a table that is very much like an operating table, as if he was anesthetized, because there's surgical tools on the table. So God is like taking the role of a supreme surgeon. At the forefront, Adam and Eve are like anatomical models, and this is drawing very much on Sander L. Gilman's work and his book Sexuality and Illustrated History, where he defends that Adam and Eve were the basic models to understand sexuality in medieval culture in Europe. So I've looked at the way the sexual organs were represented in Vesalius's work, and in the scroll in between Adam and Eve it reads, "The organs of generation are the same on the male and the female, for if you turn the scrotum, the testicles and the penis inside out, you will have all the genital organs of the female." The female genital organs in anatomical illustrations of the time were represented very much like penises, because they were thought to be an inward version of the structure of the penis. So essentially the vagina is thought of as a lesser or imperfect penis, similar to how Eve is thought of as a lesser or imperfect man, in the sense that, as we've seen in the background of the birth of Eve, she's essentially derived and secondary. So woman is created and birthed by man, whilst motherhood and the vaginal opening is being relegated by male figures. Male figures with generative and birthing capacities, like Adam birthing Eve and like God creating Eve, whilst the vagina is represented like a penis. Its inherent symbolism of birthing and creation is completely unrepresented. So in this sense, the birth of Eve is like a symbolic precursor of dissection, where the wound is the artificially created opening that substitutes the vaginal orifice and also its creative powers. Finally, I would like to talk to you about the latest woodcut that I've done, which is titled Carnal Portal. It deals with themes of creation and sacrifice using medieval iconography and vaginal symbolism. This print is divided into two sides to represent the two sides of the wound as vagina. On one side, we have creation in relation to birth, and on the other side, we have sacrifice in relation to menstruation. If we look at the circle at the very top, this is a symbol that represents the reproductive cycle. We can see the phases of the moon in relation to ovulation and the uterus with the vaginal opening, and coming out of the vaginal opening there is a baby with the umbilical cord to represent life, and on the other side there is a skull with a snake coming out to represent death. The way I think of menstruation as sacrifice is, if we think about the reproductive cycle as ovulation and the ovum every month coming out and being the potential to become life, but also if the woman doesn't become pregnant, then this ovum is lost, and through the shedding of blood this ovum and the potential of life is lost. So in a way, symbolically, can be thought of as a sacrifice and as a death. Also, if we think about the reproductive cycle as a balance of life, as a cycle of life, then menstruation is a sacrifice in the sense that it's the loss of the potential life, but it's necessary for the balance, for the carrying on of the cycle, and also to restore the balance of the uterus. Now, carrying on with the print, on the left side there is a circle where we can see Jesus as a baby, and it's inside the uterus, and we can see the ovaries at the sides. This represents creative power in relation to vaginal symbolism. And on the right we can see Jesus on the cross, and I've represented it as a skeleton to emphasize sacrifice and death. And at the top of the cross we can see a pelican, which is a medieval symbol associated to the crucifixion of Christ and the sacrifice, because at the time it was thought that the pelican with its own beak would make a wound on its chest to feed its offspring. Now, on the main panel on the left represents the birth of Eve. We can see Adam with the opening at the side, and I've represented this opening drawing on vaginal symbolism with the lips, and I've also linked it to dissection because we can see the tools at the top, and God holding his arm up and holding the tool of dissection, and the script reads, "And he opened the flesh." On the scene on the right, we can see Abraham's sacrifice, and I've represented Abraham as having a uterus and ovaries and menstruating, and there's a pool of blood at his feet. The scroll reads, "Take thy only begotten son, Isaac, and offer him in sacrifice. I will bless thy seed." I've related menstruation to the sacrifice of Abraham because the maternal sacrifice of the potential life in menstruation is related to the fatherly sacrifice, the sacrifice of the father of his only son, which is his own flesh and blood. And this sacrifice, which doesn't actually happen because at the last minute God stops Abraham and he says, "You have proven your faith, so you don't need to sacrifice your son. I offer you this lamb in sacrifice instead, so you can sacrifice, and I will bless thy seed," which means that Abraham's descent is established in the symbolic order as being the relationship between the father and the son. So we're talking about patrilineal descent, but it's drawing heavily on menstrual symbolism.